My word, January is just a hectic month where you feel that you're working pretty much 2 months in one. I'm still following up with the situation in Libya following the postponement of the presidential election last month. In this short newsletter, I want first to commend the wisdom of Elon Musk. First, for ignoring trolls, cheap people regarding the copyright infringement incident. Unfortunately, there gotta be a lot of people like that. I'm not here to give any advice to Elon in that context of action. The second point that I already mentioned prior is related to the necessity to move from representative democracy that is no longer working for so many people to direct democracy in most contexts of actions of governance and rule of administration in the United States. The COVID 19 pandemic is deepening this inefficiency at a light speed. Long story short. Moving now to speak about the work of the Gates Foundation and focusing on a research question how to create a world without pandemics. In health and science circles, people talk about the called disease X. It represents a yet unknown future pathogen that could emerge with the potential to cause disease at pandemic level proportions. When health experts began talking about this concept several years ago, it may have been seemed more sci-fi than reality. Its significance difficult to truly grasp. After nearly 2 years of a devastating pandemic, it's clear that the threat of unknown diseases is serious. In fact, the disease X is on a short list of the top global risks to public health. The threat that is posed by pandemics today and in the future is what lead to support the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, the CEPI, as mentioned by Mark Sussman, the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Very important to speak about the new 150 million commitment to CEPI by the foundation alongside the UK charity Wellcome, which is committing another $150 million. As global partnership, CEPI works to prevent, in the best case, or stop epidemics and pandemics through research, innovation, and planning in order to ensure that people everywhere have equitable access to life saving vaccines. I will get back later for the comments of Bill Gates regarding sharing more about CEPI's work, including the role in COVID 19 vaccine development. It's the kind of innovative work that will help fight against the next unknown virus more quickly, ideally preventing it from becoming another devastating pandemic. As I mentioned before, the catching hashtags for the month of January are cementing and toxic, as you know what I'm talking about. My thoughts go also once again to the people of Tonga, of course, as I mentioned prior on Twitter regarding the unfortunate events occurring therein. Giving a snapshot on the United Nations work so far in January and 2022 for that matter, getting back to what the United Nations Secretary General mentioned lately related to the objectives of the United Nations, the multilateralism actions for 2022, and speaking about that, first of all, about the COVID 19, the fact that we must go into emergency mode in this battle because it is always spreading like wildfire in the absence of vaccine that wealthy countries take for granted or hold for themselves. Countries and manufacturers must prioritize vaccine supply and create the conditions for the local production of tests, vaccines, and treatments. Among the other thing is to take urgent climate action by going into emergency mode against the climate crisis, as wealthier countries must finally make good on the $100 billion climate finance commitment to developing countries. This promise cannot wait until 2023. It must happen this year, as myself I have been mentioning that the COP26 is the last ring in order to achieve the goals of environment for the Vision 2050. We are in an emergency and none of us have years to wait. Many other things could be mentioned in the context of action of the UN work related to building sustainable peace by spending much more money and resources managing conflicts than preventing them and building peace, which is the reality of the world. It is imminent to call on strengthened investment in order to have conflict prevention and peace building to deliver sustainable peace, which is one of the axes of work that I'm focusing on counterterrorism. So we need to go into emergency mode to bring peace to a world that sees too little for it. The United Nations action areas will also focus, besides tackling the pandemic and taking urgent climate action and building sustainable peace, on putting people first in the digital world as well as transforming the global financial system. The Secretary General spoke about so many contexts of action that will need to lead us into emergency mode, as I mentioned the word many times in the last sentences, in order to get by all these objectives that are highlighted by the United Nations for 2022. Getting back onto the focus of the work of the United Nations Security Council under the presidency of Norway in January, later under the presidency of the Russian Federation in February. Among the other briefings that I will be focusing on in this context of actions, the one of the WFUNA, there are gonna be two in February. The first one will be with the President of the United Nations Security Council for the month of February, which will be from the Russian Federation. And similarly, there are gonna be another event that will gather the former members, non-permanent members of the Security Council for the years 2020 and 2021. That include Niger, Tunisia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Vietnam and Estonia, as they will be speaking about the assessment of their work during these 2 years at the United Nations Security Council. Following up with the reports of the CITED this month, that is basically focusing on the interrelationship between counterterrorism frameworks and international humanitarian law. This report has been possible through the funding provided by Switzerland. It has been prepared for informational purposes, and the contents basically focus on the counterterrorism committee efforts and the committee members. So if we want to analyze this topic furthermore, we have to look at the intersection between terrorism and armed conflicts, analyze the role of the Security Council resolutions and international humanitarian law, and addressing the impact of terrorism and counterterrorism measures on humanitarian action through two axes: the terrorism and humanitarian emergency and the protection of humanitarian and medical activities and personnel under the international humanitarian law. That goes first through the humanitarian relief personnel, objects and activities that includes itself the rights of initiative, the scope of humanitarian activities under international humanitarian law, the obligation to allow and facilitate the passage of humanitarian relief, the consent and right of control, negotiating humanitarian access with non-state armed groups parties to the conflicts. The second axis of this will be the medical personnel units, transports and activities. Finally, if you want to move back to the third point on humanitarian action, important to analyze the impact of counterterrorism measures on humanitarian activities. Fourth, will be taking into account the potential impact of counterterrorism measures on impartial humanitarian action. That includes elements of the recommendations included in the United Nations Security Resolution 2462 of 2019, paragraph 24, and Resolution 2482 of 2019 in paragraph 16. that will lead us to analyze exclusively humanitarian activities, including medical activities carried out by impartial humanitarian actors in a manner consistent with international humanitarian law and take into account the potential effect of measures. Now, if we want to analyze the second part of taking into account the potential impact of counterterrorism measures on the impartial humanitarian action, very keen to look at the trends, developments, and needs relating to the implementation of Resolution 2462 of 2019, paragraph 24, and Resolution 2482 2019, or paragraph 16. Finally, it's very important to look at a meaningful accountability for the conduct of terrorist groups' linkages between terrorism and serious violations of international humanitarian law. That includes linkages between conduct perpetrated by members of terrorist groups and serious violations of international humanitarian law, which will split us to speak first about the treatment of persons not taking direct part in hostilities, including persons hors de combat, analyzing in this context of action the violence to life and person and taking of hostages. The second type will be the violations of international humanitarian law relating to means and methods of warfare. That includes attacks on persons or objects objected under the international humanitarian law, persons and objects benefiting from special protection, the conscription of children, starvation as a method of warfare, and the pillage as well. Analyzing also the accountability for serious violations of international humanitarian law. So this is a snapshot of a very important report to read and very important to get back here for further understanding on the Security Council Resolution 2617 to 2021, 1373 of 2001, 1624 of 2005, 2178 of 2014, 2396 of 2017, and as I mentioned, 2462 of 2019, 2482 of 2019, and of course other relevant resolutions. Among the things I want to discuss besides counterterrorism, which is directly linked to it, is the issues of the Holocaust, by getting back first of all to the actions of the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program. So we're going to have the 2022 Holocaust Remembrance, and this basically will be focused on memory, dignity, and justice. That will be the theme guiding this year's event. Holocaust commemoration and education remains a global imperative, safeguarding the historical record, remembering the victims, challenging the distortion in history often expressed in contemporary anti-Semitism, brings dignity and justice to those whom the perpetration of the Holocaust intended to obliterate. The theme encompassed these concerns. Holocaust commemorative and educational activities can draw attention to the actions of Holocaust survivors in the immediate years following the devastation and brutality of the Holocaust, to reclaim their rights, their history, their cultural heritage and traditions and dignity. The role played by institutions and individuals in supporting survivors, the long-reaching impacts of the Holocaust survivors' families, and also the impact of the Holocaust on the shaping of interventions and legacy. The theme encourages actions to challenge hatred, strengthen solidarity, and champion compassion. So basically, the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program is an expression of the unwavering commitment of the United Nations to promoting the countering anti-Semitism and racism and preventing future genocides. So among what I can mention is the traditional United Nations Holocaust Memorial Ceremony, an exhibition focused on the end of the war, the displaced persons and displaced persons in camps. That's basically lead us to speak about the issues that Europe emerged from the Second World War utterly broken, with millions of refugees scattered across many countries. So the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the UNRRA, was created to resettle those displaced by the mayhem of the war and the Holocaust. The fragments from the past illuminate the work of UNRRA administrators and chart how the aftermath of catastrophic loss Holocaust survivors navigated their new lives in displaced person camps. The exhibition basically is sourced with artifacts and documents from the United Nations archives and the YIVU Institute for Jewish Research Archives. The exhibition basically is created by the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program with the YIVU Institute for Jewish Research Archives and the UN Archives with generous support of the Stockton University. There will be also a briefing on Holocaust remembrance responsibility for all society, focusing basically on the 15 years of observance by the World Body. It's a global virtual program entitled the Holocaust Remembrance Responsibility for All Society that is focusing on the memory as well and the dignity for all. There will be a commemoration service in New York at the Park East Synagogue on January the 25th in order to mark the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. There will be also United Nations Chamber Music Society virtual concert on January the 27th and a briefing about Lest We Forget Combating Holocaust Denial and Distortion. Basically, it's an opportunity to speak with the United Nations, governments, and social media companies on how to take seriously the issues of anti-Semitism that are growing and how to combat them, Holocaust denial and distortion, and how they can promote more effective Holocaust education. Also focusing on the virtual film on February the 10th called The Last Survivors. And there are gonna be other virtual series throughout the month of February regarding this context of action, which lead me also to speak about the events of the CHJAC, and one will be organized on February the 17th related to the Holocaust survivors' return to Vienna and where do they belong. And I will focus on the research question on what prompted Viennese Jews to return to their home city after the devastation of the Holocaust and what were their hopes and what did they find. In the conversation with historians, we will have the opportunity to draw upon books and understand the compromise of return to Plum survivors' experience of the rerouting in a post-Nazi society. I'm going to conclude by lauding the efforts of the People's Republic of China, the Empire of Japan, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the Republic of Korea. It is very important for the countries of Northeast Asia to work together, and I do encourage the process of negotiation